How did Israel's golden age curdle so spectacularly into national suicide? Solomon's descent began innocently enough, with love. Or perhaps more accurately, with lust cloaked in political pragmatism. His first foreign bride was an Egyptian princess, daughter of a pharaoh. This unprecedented marriage represented a diplomatic coup. Egypt, the superpower of the age, had finally acknowledged Israel as a legitimate player on the world stage. The alliance brought prestige, trade advantages, and military security. Who could argue with such benefits? Yet this first royal wedding established a template that would prove catastrophically addictive. One foreign princess became 700 royal wives and 300 concubines, a harem so vast it required its own city quarter. Each marriage sealed another treaty, opened another trade route, secured another border. Solomon was playing geopolitical chess with matrimonial pieces, expanding Israeli influence with every wedding feast. But these weren't merely women entering his bed, they were cultural Trojan horses. Each royal bride arrived with entourages of priests, servants, and cultural traditions. Each expected accommodation for her native religious practices. The biblical text is brutally direct. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the detestable god of the Ammonites. Solomon, whose name derives from shalom, peace, became the architect of Israel's spiritual disintegration. Consider the staggering hypocrisy. The same king who had fallen prostrate before Yahweh at the temple dedication, who had prayed with transcendent eloquence for God's presence to fill the sanctuary, was now bowing before Molech, a deity whose worship involved passing children through fire. The cognitive dissonance is almost unfathomable. Excavations in the Hinnom Valley have uncovered ritual sites with infant remains from this period, silent witnesses to how far Solomon's religious tolerance extended. While scholars debate whether the king personally participated in child sacrifice, the biblical indictment is clear. He built the high places where such abominations occurred. His royal patronage legitimized practices that Mosaic law condemned as worthy of capital punishment. What's particularly fascinating is how Solomon likely rationalized this spiritual schizophrenia. Ancient texts suggest he viewed himself not as abandoning Yahweh, but as a sophisticated theological connoisseur, a cosmopolitan king whose religious inclusivity reflected Israel's expanding place in the world. The archaeological record reveals Yahwistic symbols frequently juxtaposed with foreign religious iconography during this period, evidence of a syncretistic mindset rather than outright apostasy. This wasn't the crude idolatry of peasants, it was the nuanced theological compromise of intellectuals. Solomon's court likely buzzed with sophisticated arguments about cultural sensitivity, diplomatic necessity, and enlightened religious tolerance. Perhaps Solomon even convinced himself he was fulfilling Israel's destiny to be a light to nations by embracing diverse spiritual traditions. After all, hadn't Yahweh promised Abraham that all peoples on earth will be blessed through you? The psychological transformation is fascinating. The young king who had humbly asked God for wisdom now believed his intellectual brilliance qualified him to revise Israel's most fundamental covenant obligations. The man who began by building Yahweh's house concluded by constructing divine competition. Solomon essentially created an ancient version of a multi-faith prayer room on Jerusalem's skyline, with catastrophic theological implications. What made this betrayal particularly lethal was its top-down nature. When Solomon's processional entourage wound through Jerusalem's narrow streets toward these pagan shrines, common Israelites witnessed their divinely anointed king, the son of David himself, legitimizing worship that their ancestors had been commanded to eradicate. If Solomon the Wise embraced these practices, who were ordinary Israelites to object? The archaeological record confirms Scripture's account of widespread religious syncretism during this period. Household shrines across Israel increasingly featured Asherah figurines alongside traditional Yahwistic symbols. Excavated jewelry shows Egyptian scarabs and Canaanite fertility symbols worn by Israelites previously distinguished by their monotheistic practices. Solomon hadn't merely compromised his personal faith, he had triggered a national identity crisis. The geopolitical consequences were equally devastating. Solomon's religious diplomacy created the impression that Israel's distinctive covenant with Yahweh was negotiable, weakening their unique position among nations. By diluting Israel's theological distinctiveness, Solomon paradoxically undermined the very feature that made Israel valuable as an ally. Nations didn't seek treaties with Israel because they were another generic Canaanite kingdom, but precisely because their extraordinary covenant with Yahweh had produced unparalleled prosperity and military success. Solomon's compromise amounted to selling Israel's birthright for a mess of diplomatic pottage. He exchanged their unique theological identity for temporary political advantages, a devil's bargain that would ultimately destroy the United Kingdom. The divine response was both measured and devastating. God appeared to Solomon with chilling directness. "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates." The only mitigating factor was God's loyalty to David's lineage. Solomon would retain the kingdom during his lifetime, but his son would lose everything except a single tribe. The king who had unified Israel would become the architect of its permanent division. What makes this judgment particularly poignant is its poetic justice. Solomon's religious pluralism, intended to accommodate diversity, would result in a fractured nation permanently divided along religious lines. His diplomatic marriages, designed to secure Israel's borders, would trigger civil war. The king who built the temple as a center of national unity would be remembered as the man whose policies rendered that temple inaccessible to most Israelites. Solomon's tragedy is both personal and national, a cautionary tale of how intellectual brilliance, without moral boundaries, leads to catastrophe. The wisest man in history became the agent of Israel's destruction, not through military defeat but through theological compromise. The divided kingdom stands as his true legacy, a fractured nation that would never again know the glory of its united golden age. The king's horses need feeding. More grain for the royal stables. This demand, shouted by Solomon's tax collectors, became a dreaded refrain across Israel's northern territories. While Jerusalem gleamed with gold and ivory, villages in Naphtali and Zebulun groaned under crushing taxation. The same king celebrated for his wisdom had created an economic system that privileged the southern capital while bleeding the northern tribes dry. Solomon's Israel was a tale of two kingdoms even before the official split. In Jerusalem, foreign dignitaries marveled at streets lined with cedar and courts paved with precious stones. Meanwhile, in the agricultural north, families struggled to meet escalating royal demands while watching their sons conscripted into forced labor battalions. The numbers are staggering. Solomon's daily provisions required 30 cores of the finest flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, and 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer, gazelles, roebucks, and choice fowl. This single day's consumption would feed a small village for a month. The biblical text records that Solomon had 4,000 stalls for horses and 12,000 horsemen, a massive standing army requiring constant support from agricultural regions. To maintain this unprecedented opulence, Solomon divided Israel into 12 administrative districts. Notably, these districts deliberately ignored traditional tribal boundaries, weakening tribal identity and autonomy. Each district was responsible for providing the royal court's provisions for 1 month each year. The system represented a radical centralization of power unprecedented in Israel's history. Archaeological evidence confirms the biblical account of economic stratification during this period. Urban centers, particularly in Judah, show significant architectural advancements and luxury goods, while rural settlements display markers of increased economic stress. Storage facilities expanded dramatically near administrative centers, evidence of systematic resource extraction from agricultural regions. But taxation was only half the burden. Solomon's massive construction projects required labor on an unprecedented scale. The biblical text records that he conscripted 30,000 men from throughout Israel to work in Lebanon's forests, sending them in monthly shifts of 10,000. Additionally, he had 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stonecutters working in the hill country. While foreign residents bore the heaviest labor obligations, the text makes clear that King Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel. This forced labor system, known as Mas in Hebrew, represented a profound betrayal of Israel's foundational identity. The nation had been formed through liberation from Egyptian slavery, with the Exodus serving as their defining national narrative. Their covenant explicitly prohibited returning to Egypt or Egyptian systems of servitude. Yet Solomon effectively reintroduced corvée labor, the very system from which Yahweh had delivered them generations earlier. The bitter irony wasn't lost on northern Israelites. Their ancestors had escaped Pharaoh's building projects only for their descendants to be conscripted into Solomon's. The historical trauma of Egyptian bondage made this labor system particularly offensive to a people whose national anthem celebrated being freed from brick-making slavery. Jeroboam, who would later lead the Northern Secession, first appears in Scripture as an overseer of forced labor from the tribe of Joseph. When he revolted initially, he fled to Egypt, a symbolically significant choice highlighting how Solomon had recreated Egyptian oppression within Israel itself. Jeroboam's eventual return and leadership of the northern tribes represented not just political rebellion, but a second exodus from oppression. Solomon's economic policies created stark regional disparities that exacerbated existing north-south tensions. The Magnificent Temple, theoretically a unifying national symbol, was built largely with northern resources while primarily benefiting the southern tribe of Judah, where it was located. Jerusalem's prosperity came increasingly at the expense of northern territories, whose agricultural surpluses were systematically diverted to support the capital's lavish lifestyle. The archaeological record reveals that during Solomon's reign, northern territories experienced declining living standards while Judah, particularly Jerusalem, flourished. Material culture in northern villages shows reduced quality and quantity of goods during precisely the period celebrated as Israel's Golden Age. Solomon had effectively created an internal colonial system where the northern periphery existed to serve the southern core. This economic reality created the conditions for secession. When northern representatives approached Rehoboam after Solomon's death, their primary grievance was economic. "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." Their demand wasn't for independence, but for economic justice within a united kingdom. Rehoboam's notorious response, "My father made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions," merely continued Solomon's exploitative policies with even less diplomatic finesse. The Northern Secession represented not rejection of Davidic lineage per se, but refusal to remain economic vassals to Jerusalem's excesses. What makes Solomon's economic oppression particularly ironic is that it contradicted his own famous wisdom literature. Proverbs repeatedly warns against exploitation of the poor and advocates for economic justice. "Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker," states one Solomonic proverb. Yet the king's policies systematically oppressed Israel's agricultural regions while concentrating wealth in Jerusalem's elite circles. Solomon's forced labor system also violated specific Deuteronomic laws regarding kingship. The king must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. This prohibition explicitly connected royal excess with forced labor systems reminiscent of Egyptian bondage, precisely what Solomon instituted. The king's economic policies created generational grievances that outlasted his reign. Northern tribes passed down stories of sons taken for labor battalions, daughters sent to serve in Jerusalem's expanding palace complex, and fields stripped bare to feed the royal court. These collective memories created the social foundation for secession when opportunity arose. Solomon essentially sacrificed national unity on the altar of royal splendor. His architectural achievements, while magnificent, came at the cost of sustainable governance. The king who prayed for wisdom to distinguish between right and wrong established economic systems that privileged southern elites while exploiting northern laborers. His legendary wisdom failed to recognize that palaces built through oppression stand on foundations of sand. The divided kingdom was not merely a theological consequence of Solomon's religious syncretism, but also the predictable outcome of his unsustainable economic policies. When northern tribes declared, "What share do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse," They were rejecting not just Rehoboam's arrogance, but generations of economic extraction that had left them impoverished while Jerusalem gleamed with gold. The old prophet's weathered hands trembled as he gripped the new cloak wrapped around his shoulders. Ahijah of Shiloh had spent decades declaring Yahweh's words, but never had he been asked to deliver such a devastating message. Before him stood Jeroboam, a rising star in Solomon's administration, an Ephraimite of exceptional ability who had caught the king's eye. Little did Solomon know that this talented young man would become the instrument of divine judgment against his dynasty. What happened next would be seared into Israel's collective memory for generations. Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes." This dramatic prophetic act revealed the most devastating aspect of Solomon's failure. His actions had triggered direct divine intervention to dismantle what his father David had built. The division of Israel wasn't merely political fallout from poor governance, it was explicit divine judgment, a supernatural rending of the kingdom mirroring Ahijah's torn garment. What makes this divine judgment particularly striking is that God himself became the active agent in Israel's dissolution. The Hebrew text is unambiguous. I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand. The verb used here, kara, is the same violent tearing action performed on the cloak. God wasn't merely permitting division. He was actively causing it. This divine intervention represents the ultimate catastrophe in Israel's theological understanding. Their entire national identity was built on the conviction that Yahweh had chosen them, liberated them from Egypt, and established them in the Promised Land. Their kings ruled by divine right as Yahweh's representatives. Now that same God was deliberately dismantling the kingdom he had established. The timing of this divine pronouncement is significant. It came while Solomon still reigned in apparent glory. Jerusalem still gleamed with gold, foreign dignitaries still arrived bearing gifts, and the magnificent temple still stood as the crown jewel of his achievements. To human eyes, the kingdom appeared at its zenith. Yet behind this facade of success, the spiritual reality was one of such profound failure that God had already issued the kingdom's death sentence. What makes this judgment particularly poignant is that it came despite God's extraordinary patience. The biblical text records that God had appeared to Solomon twice, direct divine manifestations extraordinarily rare in Scripture. Solomon had received explicit warnings about the consequences of abandoning Yahweh's covenant. Yet even with supernatural guidance and unparalleled wisdom, the king persisted in his destructive course. The nature of the judgment contained a terrible symmetry. Solomon had divided his heart among foreign gods. In response, God would divide his kingdom. The king who couldn't maintain theological boundaries would see his nation's geographical boundaries permanently fractured. The ruler who built high places for multiple deities would see his people scattered among multiple rival kingdoms. Yet, even in judgment, divine mercy remained. For David's sake, the dissolution would be delayed until after Solomon's death. And for that same reason, his son would retain one tribe, Judah, ensuring the continuation of David's lineage. This remnant provision was not because Solomon deserved dynastic continuation, but solely due to God's prior covenant with David. The prophetic encounter with Jeroboam revealed another dimension of divine judgment. God was not merely removing tribes from Solomon's son, he was actively raising up a rival king. Jeroboam was promised his own dynasty that could have equaled David's. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, if only he would remain faithful to Yahweh. This represents an astonishing theological development, God establishing a second chosen king within the chosen nation. When the kingdom actually divided after Solomon's death, the event unfolded with such precision that even secular historians struggle to explain it as merely political upheaval. Rehoboam, despite commanding the powerful Judahite army, was inexplicably paralyzed from military response by a single prophetic message. This is what the Lord says: do not go up to fight against your brothers. Go home, every one of you, for this is my doing. The recognition that the division was of the Lord prevented what would have been a bloody civil war. Even Solomon's son, arrogant and foolish as the biblical text portrays him, recognized he could not fight against divine judgment. The 10 northern tribes established their separate kingdom with Jeroboam as king, precisely as Ahijah had prophesied years earlier while tearing his cloak. The consequences of this divine judgment proved permanent and catastrophic. The united monarchy, a brief, glorious moment in Israel's history, would never be restored. The divided kingdoms followed divergent paths, with the northern kingdom establishing rival worship centers at Dan and Bethel to prevent religious pilgrimages to Jerusalem. These rival sanctuaries, complete with golden calves reminiscent of the Exodus apostasy, accelerated the northern kingdom's spiritual decline. Within 2 centuries, the northern kingdom would be utterly destroyed by Assyria, its population scattered and largely lost to history, the famous 10 lost tribes of Israel. The small southern kingdom of Judah would survive longer but eventually fall to Babylon, though its people would maintain their identity through exile and return. Even after the Babylonian exile, when a remnant returned to rebuild Jerusalem, they controlled only a fraction of David and Solomon's original territory. The divided kingdom was never fully reunited. By Jesus' time, Samaria, the former northern kingdom, and Judea remained culturally and religiously distinct regions with centuries of mutual antagonism, the aftershocks of Solomon's failure still reverberating 1,000 years later. Perhaps most devastating was the spiritual fracturing that accompanied political division. Solomon's temple, intended as the permanent dwelling place of God's presence and the center of national worship, became inaccessible to most Israelites. The northern kingdom developed increasingly syncretistic religious practices, while even Judah experienced cycles of reform and apostasy. The unified worship of Yahweh that David had established became a casualty of Solomon's compromises. What makes this judgment so profound is that it came against the king most blessed with divine gifts. Solomon had received wisdom directly from God, had been entrusted with building Yahweh's temple, and had experienced divine appearances. No king had greater advantages or opportunities. Yet his failure was correspondingly catastrophic, demonstrating that spiritual privilege brings proportional accountability. The divine judgment against Solomon carries a timeless warning: no achievement, no matter how magnificent, can compensate for covenant unfaithfulness. The king who built the most splendid temple in Israel's history ultimately triggered God's decision to tear the kingdom apart. The ruler celebrated for unparalleled wisdom became the cautionary tale of how intellectual brilliance, without spiritual fidelity, leads to disaster.